Hi friends in the diocese. Today I have with me a very special guest to interview. This is somebody I've been waiting a long time to tell the diocese about. Starting in 2014, this person will be our new Dean of Wellington Cathedral. So I'd like to introduce you to Digby Wilkinson. Now Digby, just tell us what you've been up to lately.
Well, Justin, I've just come back from walking the Camino de Santiago with Jane, which, for those of you who don't know, is an 800-kilometre trek from across from France over the Pyrenees and then right out to the west coast of Spain to a place called Santiago, where apparently the remains of St James are entombed, and people have made pilgrimage there for about the last 1,000 years. So we did the main section, which is 800 kilometres from France. It's great.
Good on you. So tell me, how come you decided that you were interested in being the Dean of Wellington?
Well, it all started actually at your ordination. So I came down from Palmerston to that and was sitting up in the chancel with everybody else. And in a moment where we couldn't actually see or understand what was going on, while everybody else was texting and looking at their phones and the internet, I had this small epiphany. It was really a question. The question was, what would it be like to be the Dean of the Cathedral? And that's not a question I've ever asked before. I hadn't realised at that point in time that Dean Frank had actually resigned, and so I duly went home at the end of the day, and it was a couple of weeks later that I found out that he had actually resigned. So that question popped back in my mind, and it wouldn't actually leave me. And I asked some serious questions about why I'd asked that question, currently being in a Baptist church, but also being an Anglican priest at the same time. So that's when I had a conversation with you and had a conversation with some other friends and decided, at least tentatively, to actually put in my CV to see what would happen. Really with the deeper belief that actually it would probably open alternative doors that I hadn't yet seen, rather than thinking that this would actually be the outcome. So that's why I applied.
That's what we're looking like now, but if we go back to 2002, there's quite a different story happening in 2002, isn't there?
Yeah, 2002 was the beginning of a big crisis for me. Well, actually, the beginning is not quite the right word. It was the climax of a long crisis that had been beginning for 2 years. It's not so much the details of what happened, but it's really why it happened. And for me, I began the process of burnout, which I hadn't really recognised. I knew something was up with me, and I'd become relatively unhappy in ministry at the time. But it was a paradoxical sense of unhappiness, because on one hand I loved what I was doing, but on the other hand it was also getting on top of me. And a series of events occurred in the life of the church which created a degree of stress and pressure for me. And I think in reflection, I was young, I was naive in the church that I was part of and in my dealings with the individuals at the time. And I developed an addiction to spending, which was in part my way of starting to feel happy again. But like most addictions, you go out and you buy something, you feel better for a little bit, and then of course it wears off. And that addiction extended to buying mountain bikes, and then it resulted in me making a couple of false insurance claims, partly to fund this addictive process. And that all came to a crunch in 2002 at the end of the year, and it resulted in me resigning immediately from ministry and having to face my own demons that had been erupting over that particular time. It was probably the most appalling experience that I've ever been through, as most people can probably imagine, partly because it was so public, but also partly because you let yourself down and your family down and your friends down in ways that you can't really describe. And at the time people would talk about it being a fall from grace, and that was certainly my own experience. It was certainly a fall into a very dark hole. But it was also a period in which I experienced God's grace in ways that I had never experienced before, in small ways. And I experienced grace as being a very firm, containing environment, and it was a place of recovery, of restitution for me to others, a place of reconciliation over a couple of years, and then finally an unexpected form of restoration, which largely occurred in the Anglican Church at Holy Trinity Tower.
So, talk us about then how 2002 has now impacted your ministry today, as in how is life different post 2002?
I think prior to 2002, I, like many people in ministry, particularly in evangelical churches back then, was caught up in, I suppose, the beginnings of business models in the life of the church. It became, ministry moved very much from the spiritual care of the souls that God's given you to really growing God's church. And in that sense it became a process by which you were a wheel within the mechanism trying to make the machine work, and it was about results and outcomes and pre-planning and making sure things were going very well. But in the midst of all that, I realised that my own spiritual journey with God had started to dry up, but yet the machine was actually working quite well. I mean, I think the thing that people struggle with most of the time is that actually the ministry was good at one level, but for me it was very bad at another level. So I actually relinquished the central components of ministry itself, which was really about prayer, worship, and the embodiment of Christ in our world, really, and forming a Christian community that actually takes those things seriously, rather than just, putting it bluntly, placing bums on pews and being able to feel as though the ministry was actually going well. So it's changed.
So that was 2002, and then through the restoration process, you years later re-entered ministry and became an Anglican priest
That's
in
right.
Tauranga. So what have you been doing the last few years then?
Well, I got ordained in 2006 by John Bluck, and that occurred principally because I'd recovered in Holy Trinity Tauranga at the time, and then in that time I returned to university and completed a couple of degrees that I'd started. At the end of that, when I was starting to wonder what I was going to do, I was sitting in church one day and I actually felt God say to me, you know, it's time to return. And that's something that I never thought I'd hear again. I was really looking at alternative ways of being. I was looking at doing a PhD and perhaps going into education. Certainly return to ministry wasn't on the cards. At that same time, just shortly after that, the vestry of Holy Trinity came and asked me if I'd join the staff and become what they called their preaching associate, because they weren't too sure what you did with an ex-Baptist pastor coming on the staff of an Anglican church. So because that was my particular gift, I suppose, I was happy to take that role up, and it was, for me, it was a really intriguing experience. And it was shortly after that John Bluck came to me and said, well, you can't keep doing this. Really, if you're going to do ministry properly, we need to actually go through the process of ordination. Is that what you'd like to do? And oddly enough, it was a very clear yes for me that this is what I want to do, because I think coming to the Anglican Church in those 2 years, partly for recovery and then for doing ministry, in a strange way felt like an odd coming home. And without going into all the details as to why that was the case, certainly the ordination process at the Cathedral in Napier City confirmed that. And I really did believe at the time that we were going to have a long stint in the Anglican Church ahead. And then a little time after that, we were planning on staying at Holy Trinity. That was where it was heading. And then Palmerston North Central Baptist came banging on the door, and that was very unexpected, and asked us if we consider, or asked me if I consider taking up the role of senior pastor of this church, this very large church. And we said no several times to them, and it just didn't seem to be the right thing to do. And then actually what happened was it was really Jane who started the process of thinking, actually maybe we need to consider this seriously. In part I think was because for Jane anyway there was unfinished business in the Baptists. We left so abruptly under difficult circumstances that it felt like this was an opportunity to deal to some of those past things and finish well in the Baptist movement. So for me it was a pragmatic decision to move to Palmerston. For Jane it felt like it was definitely a pastoral move for her, and actually it turned out to be a very good experience. But I think for me and for Jane we've always known there was going to be a return back to Anglican ministry, and for me definitely because I've had a fair bit of involvement with All Saints down the road on a fairly regular basis in terms of preaching and presiding there and being involved with their congregation.
Right, so while being Central Baptist pastor, you've been sneaking off to All Saints doing
I've been
Eucharist.
I've been going both ways for some period of time, and I've actually really enjoyed it. I'm known here as the vicar of Palmerston North Central Baptist Church, so, and there's been some sneaky introduction of liturgical material into the life of the church, which those who are ex-Anglicans who are here have noticed.
Okay, fast forward then, 2014,
Yep.
be Dean of Wilkinson Cathedral. What's your vision? What's your hope for the cathedral?
Well, there's three things that are important to me. The first thing that's important to me is I've always believed that you have to work out what it is that God has placed in your hand to work with. And I think my initial role or task in the life of the church is to see precisely who it is that I'm working with, what the cathedral is actually like. And it's one thing to attend there and have a look on the outside. It's another thing to be a part of the community itself. The second thing, I suppose at first blush when I had an interview and also went down and had a look, is to, for me anyway, to align something of the internal community life of the church with its public life. Cathedrals are complex communities, obviously, because they are on one hand a sacred space for the entire Wellington city, as are most cathedrals. They're places that people come for a variety of different reasons, and sometimes just simply anonymity. But buried within that public face is also this private space, which is the community of people who call themselves the cathedral congregation. And I think firstly it's to look at how we align what is actually hopefully going to be a vibrant community, that becomes the experience of people who come into the public space. So rather than just being a building that we have events in, it's also a place that people come and experience that vibrancy. And certainly saw that in Spain. We went the Camino is essentially a journey through all of the Catholic cathedrals and churches across the north of Spain. And we found a variety of different churches and different experiences. And one of the things that was very clear, and I think this is certainly the case for churches in New Zealand, and very appropriately cathedrals, is that where there is a vibrant community, the sense of sacred space is multiplied considerably. But where there was no vibrant community, that sense of sacred space moved very quickly to just being a historic building. And I think that that's something that needs to be, I'd like to think that we could do together. And the second thing is to look at how we change, make the demography of the cathedral marry with the demography of Wellington City in terms of ages, in terms of cultures, so that our congregation is represented in all those areas, and that it becomes a community that is diverse. And I suppose that would be done initially in thinking about it by beginning things that work alongside what currently is. So we maintain the excellence of worship that is there in the life of the church in terms of its education and hopefully its hospitality. I can't speak to that. But alongside that, we begin the process of starting alternative forms of ministry which are appropriate for different age ranges, but doing them in such a way that grasps, I think, the beauty and the energy of liturgy, but harnessed in such a way that it's relevant to a new generation. And that, I think, is one of the roles of the cathedral in Wellington, if it's to be a cathedral. Yeah.
Good. So just in finishing then, Digby, you've mentioned Jane,
Yep.
and so just in finishing, tell us a bit about who make up the rest of your life. So who are your family? So talk us through them.
Okay, well, obviously the most important person is Jane. Jane and I have been married for 27 years, and we are both committed to ministry. We train together for ministry, and Jane is a significant anchor in my life, and we think and communicate reasonably well together, and we think largely about our ministry life together as well. Jane is a spiritual director and is also involved in the training of spiritual directors and is a participant on the Spiritual Growth Ministries workshop. And she's also been doing some training in supervision. She has a great deal of interest in clergy supervision and their care, particularly their spiritual care and their spiritual well-being. We have 3 children. Mitchell is 20, he'll be 21 at the end of this year. Our second son, Elliot, is 17. He's in his second to last year of school. And then we have our daughter, who's 11, Lucy. And these 3 whirlwinds make up our family and keep us busy and on our feet. And we really enjoy them. Yeah.
That's good. Well, Dick, we just want to say a final word of thanks. Thanks for hearing the call and responding to the call. And we, as in the Diocese of Wellington and the Cathedral, are just so happy and excited about your appointment. Actually, I think it's fair to say that the Cathedral nominators and all those involved with the process were deeply impacted, particularly, by your interview, etc. We are very, very excited, and so, we look forward to many years ahead and look forward to actually getting you in the beginning of 2014. So all the best till then.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that, and we're all very much looking forward to it now. And in terms of the process, we look back and we say it has the fingerprints of God stamped all over it, and in that sense, we look forward to it with a great deal of expectation, anticipation, about what the future will hold.
And now that you've done the Camino, I assume you won't need transport from Palmerston to Wellington. You'll be walking there with all your
walk
gear.
everywhere.
You'll be
That's
walking
right.
everywhere.
Yes,
Good.
yes, yes.
Well, it'll save the cathedral some money.
Yeah, well,
Good.
yeah.